Hello, void and all who inhabit it. It's me. And on a scale from Augustus Hill to Joe Goldberg, how unreliable is your narrator? Before we get started, I just want to clarify the purpose of today's semi-shallow deep dive. There's a huge conversation to be had about what is being portrayed in Euphoria and the ages of the characters participating and affected by these things. I'm going to link some other recent explorations into the content of the show that provide some varied perspectives if you're interested in that kind of examination. However, the controversial content is often the focus when folks talk about the show. My friend suggested I read Drew Gregory's recaps of season 2, and I think she puts it best when she says that the issue is not what Sam Levinson is writing, but how and why he's writing it. For the most part, I think that a lot of the topics presented in the show could be age appropriate and timely, whether that's comfortable or not. So while we will, for a very small portion of this video, be looking at the specifics of the story, I want to mostly focus on the structure and production of the show, at least what we know of it based on interviews and personal speculation, because that's the weakest part in my opinion. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. I think one of the most basic questions to ask of a story is who are we supposed to care about and why? Of the cast of characters, whose perspectives and narratives are the most important to the story, and how is that set up? I've had issue with the way Euphoria has struggled to answer these questions since season 1. The importance and relevance of secondary characters to the main story is not always clear, and Rue's centrality as the main protagonist is even murky at times. Both Rue getting lost in the story and the lack of clarity around why we're following this specific grouping of characters becomes extremely apparent in the penultimate episode of season 2. From the structure of that episode, it makes much more sense for the show to be from Lexi's perspective, the same way the play is. The setup of the whole series could have then been Lexi watching her best friend and her sister move on and away from her with this new cast of people in their lives. Instead, Euphoria is 6 degrees of separation from Rue Bennett, which sets us up to learn more about the father, of the boyfriend, of the best friend, of the sister, of the former best friend, than we learn about Rue's own sister Gia. In comparison, we can look at a show like Veronica Mars. I love Veronica Mars for a myriad of reasons, despite its flaws, but in this case, I think it's a strong example of a show with a huge cast that remembers to connect everyone back to either Veronica or the main case of the season. The further a character is from either of those things, the less we get to know about them, and vice versa, because the focus of the series is Veronica and the mystery of the season. Veronica Mars is also a show mostly about teenagers that occasionally gives its adult characters more in-depth storylines, but even then, there's a limit on how deep we go. Again, information that does not affect Veronica or the main case gets left behind for the most part. The original Israeli series that Euphoria is an adaptation of seemed to have a similar structure, given that the show focused on a group of kids who are all impacted by the death of a peer and centered on one girl who feels responsible for that death. The narrative connects all the main characters to a fictional interpretation of the aftermath of a traumatic happening. An alternative structure that's very common in teen shows can be seen in a series like Degrassi, wherein an ensemble cast of teens are navigating specific age-related issues. An elevated after-school special, if you will. Whether the focus is a character, a situation, or a thematic exploration, each episode is meant to be planted in the premise of the show. The premise is the driving force behind the story. But in Euphoria, I don't feel that it is ever all that clear if we are supposed to be focusing on Rue and the way her behavior impacts those who fall in her orbit, or all of these random characters and their barely intersecting storylines. The premise also greatly impacts how narrative time is structured. In Euphoria, because the importance of each character is inconsistent, the amount of time we're spending with them and their stories is all over the place as well. Admittedly, having a distinct premise doesn't always mean a story will be good. A great example is Pretty Little Liars, which lost the plot even though the murder mystery premise stayed the same. But even in that show, the connection between characters were clear, although sometimes extremely stupid. We can compare two shitty and adulterous fathers from both series as an example of how premise influences narrative time. In Pretty Little Liars, we learn that Arya's dad Byron had an affair before the start of the show and that Arya caught him at one point with his mistress. Never do we get an episode where a major storyline is focused on unraveling why Byron did this or how he feels about his marriage, because the point of the affair is the impact it has on Arya, directly and indirectly, especially with regards to how it can be used to blackmail her. In Euphoria, we learn very early that Nate's father, Cal, likes to hook up with people he finds on dating apps and record their encounters without their consent or knowledge, including underage Jules. But the story's interest in the impact that has on Nate, and more so Jules, who is the closest to Rue, shifts to looking at the root of that behavior in Cal, which, what the fuck does that have to do with anything? Sidebar, that 15-minute long backstory for Cal, absolutely unnecessary. Not only is the trope of the self-hating and volatile closeted man overcooked as fuck, but to apply it to a literal predator? Disgusting! Euphoria could have mainly focused on Rue or established a reason for these core set of characters to have overlapping stories. I don't care which setup Levinson chose, I just think he needed to stick with one. Euphoria often wavers between the two, which whips us back and forth and across different characters, including Rue in season 2, in a way that's more disorienting than entertaining because Levinson seemingly cannot keep track of his own story. I know somewhere in the ether, someone will argue about the genius of playing with structure, but my thing is, you have to establish a structure before you can play with it. And even then, you have set up a boundary of what you can do. No one wakes up one day and is just able to play jazz. Even if they can play their instrument extremely well, that musician still has to learn scales and how to keep time before they can move on to improvising. And even then, improvisation is not a synonym for disorder. There are rules to what you are doing, and you can set them, but you then have to follow them. To be clear, writing a season of television can be a process of building the plane while you're flying it. There can be shifts made to future scripts in the midst of filming, often to patch up holes, but that's not what's going on from my perspective. I don't believe a story can tinker with dynamic in different ways to get to an end point if the writer doesn't even know where they are going. As the show has progressed, it has felt less and less like Euphoria has a solid understanding of who a majority of these characters are or will grow to be, and why their stories need to be told in conjunction to each other. The wobbly structure of season 2 has amplified the super vague premise of the entire series and the fact that the show often lacks focus. But to top it all off, the character development is cheeks. We're going to try to keep this part brief because, again, it's not the what, but the how and the why. However, the most openly talked about decline in season 2 was that of Kat and her storyline. Full disclosure, I did not like Kat's storyline in season 1 either. I think much like his multi-hyphenate in arms Tyler Perry, Sam Levinson perhaps does not know what the fuck he is talking about when it comes to sexual trauma and sex work. As a result, I did not think that a story about a 16-year-old girl making illicit content after her first sexual encounter was recorded and distributed without her consent was explored all that well. But That's a lot of content to mine. However, season 2 only gave us a sexually unsatisfied and bored Kat who is on screen for something like 2 minutes by the time we get to the end of her storyline in episode 6. A character like Kat could be compelling with strong stories that make us uncomfortable for thought-provoking reasons. She could push at our expectations and understandings and perceptions of plus-size women and girls. Instead, she's hypersexual until that's no longer titillating, and then she's trashed. Even if we remove the specifics of her storyline, reducing her character to BB status is a sharp and noticeable drop for a main character with no explanation. Another character who I saw less about but got just as, if not more quickly discarded, was McKay. Oddly enough, McKay also has an experience of sexual trauma in season 1, and it doesn't matter. It's never talked about again. He shows up in like 3 scenes in the season 2 premiere and then disappears. Season 2 takes place something like 6 weeks after the first, I believe, and here we have another major character effectively written out of the show with no rationale, no mention, just trauma and vibes. Now, you could argue,
McKay is in college. He should be gone anyway.
But my question then is, why wasn't his exit written? And yet still, why was he around to begin with? What was his connection to the main story if he could be so easily removed? And it's not that McKay had to be useless. In the carnival episode in season 1, Rue catches Gia smoking weed with McKay's brother. If the show was really about Rue and Gia was allowed to be an actual character instead of a screaming prop, McKay could have had purpose in a set of storylines around Gia's interactions with his brothers, let alone exploring what is to come of his relationship and his connection to Cassie after everything that happened in season 1. When looking at Kat in season 1, there is again a lot of content to be mined there, but something that always stuck out to me is that Kat is shown as Jules' first friend, but we never explore what that means. Kat could have easily been set up in season 2 as a foil to Elliot as the bestie to one half of Rules. Or we could have just spent more time exploring how she perceives sex and her body now that she has a relationship and is removed from some of the more salacious activities she was engaging in season 1. I bring up these 2 characters specifically because they most blatantly feel like they were just meant to be whittled down to a set of controversial scenes, but I think you could make a similar argument about most of the characters. We are introduced to people who are flawed and have room to grow, and then instead of watering those seeds, we are presented an entirely new set of individuals, it feels like. Through it all, it is clear which characters and arguably which actors Levinson favors, and that's detrimental to the story. Sydney Sweeney will make a great horror movie debut when she is inevitably cast in one, but her character's pivot in this show is jarring. Not because it's innovative or provocative, but because it feels like a series of scene study exercises cobbled together and sold as a story. Instead of exploring Cassie's motivation or why she would immediately latch onto her best friend's abusive ex-boyfriend, who consistently, including the night they first hooked up, degraded her as nothing but a sexual object to other men, including her own ex-boyfriend, we get some beautiful visuals inspired by Mexican murals. We get a lot of tears. We get some probably unintentional but extremely hilarious scenes. We get acting, Juilliard, and very little plot consistency. The character arcs in season 2 are particularly disjointed because of a lack of tracking from season 1. There's a jump in development from point A to point Q. Sometimes it can be connected back, but oftentimes it cannot. We can blame season 2, which admittedly was all over the place, but most of these characters started off rather siloed and set up to navigate their storylines alone, with little overlap, which goes back to structure and narrative time. In season 1, we rarely see the largest friend group interacting outside of moments connected to romantic pursuits or pre-gaming, for example. The backstory cold opens were a great storytelling device, but they also overemphasize a feeling of separation between the characters. If there's no center to connect back to, no nucleus we are all orbiting, these stories can become so detached that a character can feel like two separate people depending on when and where they show up. I also want to be clear that it's not that the points these characters arrive at are completely illogical. My issue, again, is how and why we are arriving to these points. The paths these characters are placed on are full of holes in favor of being visually stimulating. Jules is a great example of this. She has a great character study episode where she talks about her self-perception and divorcing it from men's approval. Season 2 Jules, who cheats with Elliot, feels incongruous with where we left her, not because that is an entirely unreasonable spot for her to arrive at, but because we skipped several steps before landing. Huge steps considering how little time passes between the special episodes and the start of season 2. The character study episodes for Jules and Rue are also super interesting when looking at the show as a whole. As some of the best episodes in the entire series, they're great examples of the moments of individual character resonance that are the strongest parts of Euphoria. However, that strength is also what makes critiquing the series so difficult to do so. Viewers, particularly teenage viewers, will often argue that the reality of the experiences or the scenes that ring true make the show worth defending. I think it's great that parts of this show can resonate so deeply with people, and that perhaps that's what the focus of season 2 should have been, to continue digging into these characters and how they can relate to a wide audience. But a story having moments of resonance does not mean that it is narratively sound. At the end of the day, this is the production of scripted content. There needs to be a strong beginning, middle, and end wherein characters have dynamic arcs of growth, resonant arcs of growth within episodes, over a season, and throughout the series. There's an emphasis on compelling moments over cohesive storytelling, and ultimately I find that detrimental. Folks also often like to argue that
Euphoria is based on Sam Levinson's life.
But it's not. Again, this show is an adaptation of an Israeli series, which is to say the framework, which arguably isn't even that unique because of how vague it is, was not entirely built from scratch. There's some emotional connection in how Levinson wrote, namely Rue and a little bit of Lexi in season 2, it seems. To Levinson's credit, some of the strongest parts of the show are those dealing with Rue, her struggle with addiction, and the impact that has not only on her psyche, but with multiple relationships in her life. But again, a story is more than a collage of profound scenes. Moreover, most TV shows have a writer's room or consultants or both because there are always gaps. There's always something you're not noticing or cannot speak to or forget to track because writing a season of television requires you to remember a lot of shit. If we look over the show as a whole, some of the best episodes, some of the strongest scenes are those that were collaboratively made. Yet Levinson is doubling down on doing it all by himself, as evidenced in season 2 being entirely written and directed by him. Euphoria is Levinson's first and so far only TV writing credit, and he should accept the help and collaboration that he seems to value so much when it comes to acting. I don't want to suggest that newer writers can't produce compelling stories. We don't have to look that far to find writer-creators who have made some of the best television in recent memory. But if we were to look at someone like Issa Rae or Michaela Cole, who both wrote stories on HBO inspired by their own lives, we would see that they still had help. And to go back to structure, because it always goes back to structure, at least today, Insecure and I May Destroy You are distinctly about one or two main characters. If Rue being written from Levinson's own experience is an example of the depth of the show, is supposed to be the focus of the show, why isn't Euphoria mostly about Rue? Why is she missing or in the background for a large part of the second season? I often turn to the after-show breakdowns that HBO provides to flesh out some of these questions I have about character and story depth. But I have mixed feelings about those because I don't think an audience should need a supplementary piece of media to grasp the basics of a story. What's worse, perhaps, for Euphoria is how little they even do that. While the Enter Euphoria segments can be helpful for understanding actor interpretation and experience, these segments, especially for season 2, focus a lot on the aesthetics of the show. The visuals, the musical selections, and particularly the season 2 decision to shoot on physical film are also often cited as part of the genius of the show, so it makes sense that they would spend so much time talking about it. However, it can feel like the narrative aspect of this visual media is forgotten in favor of focusing on the visuals. And it's a shame because based on the praise I've heard from people who've read the pilot, I'm sure the script is really compelling. I'm sure as an actor, some of these characters are really dynamic and experimental to play. On top of that, Levinson seems to deeply value when actors can take his vision and elevate it through their own interpretation. But we as the audience also need to understand what the characters are going through. The rationale behind shifts in story structure and character trajectory should come across on the screen to people who haven't read what's on the page, who don't know the internal monologues, who weren't in the production meetings. I think a focus on what's most visually stimulating or provocative without fidelity to narrative cohesion can not only lead to character decisions that feel disjointed or irrational, but also totally derail plot lines. For all this emphasis on wanting a visual tone, it's odd that there wouldn't have been a shot list, but allegedly, filming days were extremely long because Levinson, who again directed every episode in season 2, would start filming without knowing what he wanted to accomplish for the day. A shot list, or list of every moment to be filmed, is a basic planning document that helps direct the crew and cast. It is both your schedule for the day and your plan for how the episode will visually take place. At the most basic level, to film without one is to have folks working for 12 to 17 hours in Euphoria's case with little to no plan. Returning to our focus on structure, I think it's also reflective of a lack of intention in the storytelling to just shoot aimlessly and figure it all out in post. The same can be said of Levinson's lack of outlining before writing his scripts. Winging it and writing as you go might be cute for a little 2-hour movie about a couple screaming at each other in a glass house, but a TV series where we're meant to track the growth and development of at least 6 major characters, you need a plan. And if that's not your strong suit, that's okay. Arguably, I've heard that outlining is 90% of the job, but ignoring that, struggling at some parts of the writing process is exactly the benefit behind collaboration and writers' rooms. If you can't do it, somebody else can, or they can help you figure it out, but that can't happen if you're all alone. Now, can it? I think Euphoria is a bit like Game of Thrones in that it was best when there were support railings for the show. Having the Israeli series to compare to and having those creators be an active part of season 1 helped provide the basic skeletons of a few characters and storylines. Inviting actors to write or collaborate on scenes and episodes has provided some of the strongest parts of the series as a whole. The initial backstory cold opens provided some consistency in structure, even if it could mean characters felt isolated to the point of detachment. The narration, as questionable as it was, provided some regularity to a set of chaotic storylines. Pulling away from, if not outright removing, these support pieces has exposed and exacerbated the hollow center of the show. Amil Niazi, in an episode of Pop Chat, asked, "After you take away the violence and the sex and the extremes, what's left? And is it actually really prestige? Is it actually really good?" She wavers towards no, and I not only agree, but believe that the weakness of the storytelling can be directly correlated to the amount of on-screen vulgarity. As season 2 was released, 4 separate actresses in various interviews shared their concerns about excessive nudity and inappropriate storylines. While adjustments were made based on their concerns, I wouldn't be surprised if the plan was to focus more on shock value and the work of the amazing lighting department and the best soundtrack money could buy and the nostalgic feel of filming on actual physical film, then acknowledging that the stories were still so flat. Sophomore seasons are often rough, and rewriting a series to film during a global pandulce that has allegedly ended sounds incredibly challenging. But this show, that could be so deeply compelling, has always relied on awe and controversy and strong-ass acting over story. Already renewed for a season 3, Euphoria could come back stronger than ever, but I doubt it. I'm not sure I even want to tune in to check. Matter of fact, I'm gonna let y'all watch it first, especially if Sam Levinson is doing it all on his own again. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. If you voted in the poll, thank you for voting in the poll. Do you watch Euphoria? How do you feel about the show? I know a lot of people engage with it secondhand, particularly through tweets or reviews or unpackings like this, so I'm interested to know. I feel like season 2 really dampened most people's excitement about it, but I still want to hear from you. Anyway, I am, as always, swamped with shit to do, so until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.